Hello, everyone, and welcome to this, the first seminar in the Housing Agency's summer series of webinars on housing vulnerability. You're all very welcome. This is going to be the first of 3 seminars that we're going to run over the summer months. In approximately 5 weeks, on the 29th of July, we will be running a seminar on health and housing vulnerability. And then approximately 5 weeks after that, on the 9th of September, we will be running a third seminar, which will be on the subject of women and housing vulnerability. So details of both of those events will be available in due course on the Housing Agency's website, housingagency.ie. So please do check in due course if you're interested in those events. To set the scene for the entire webinar series, I thought I would set out some statistics on housing vulnerability, very broadly defined. Back in March, the Housing Agency published its summary of social housing needs assessments. And this is our annual count of the number of households that are qualified for social housing support, but whose social housing need is not being met. And there was some good news in the statistics that we published back in March. The number of households whose social housing needs were not being met had fallen during the year by almost 10%. And the waiting list had fallen in 25 of the 31 local authority areas across the country. So that is clearly very positive. However, despite this, and despite the fact that there was a 6,800 drop in the number of households whose housing needs weren't being met, it remains the fact that almost 69,000 households are on the housing list in Ireland. In addition, there are particular concentrations of housing vulnerability. For example, 52% of all households on the housing list are single adult households. And I know that this is something that some of our speakers are going to pick up on as we go through the webinar later on. Okay, so today's webinar has a very specific focus on key issues in tackling homelessness. And we have 2 very accomplished speakers that we're very grateful to have, and thank you very much to both of them. Firstly, we have Dr. Ligia Teixeira. Lígia is one of the foremost international policy experts on homelessness working in the UK. Lígia has made instrumental contributions to guide academic and policy research through her research-based work in various roles. Lígia has worked at the London School of Economics, at the United Nations, at the Young Foundation, at Crisis, and now Lígia is the founding chief executive of the Centre for Homelessness Impact. In 2019, Lígia was conferred the award of Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences for her contribution to social science. And Lígia, we're absolutely delighted to have you on board for today's event, and thank you for assisting us. Our second speaker is someone that many of you, I think, will already know. Bob Jordan is the National Director of Housing First, based in Dublin City Council. Bob is responsible for driving the national rollout of Housing First and ensuring that government targets are met. Prior to his current role, Bob was a special advisor in the Department of Housing. He was formerly CEO of the housing charity Threshold from 2007 to 2016. And Bob has also been a senior manager in the Dublin Simon community. Bob is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and TU Dublin, and he holds postgraduate qualifications from Dublin City University. Again, Bob, we're absolutely delighted to have you on board, and thanks for joining us. Okay, I know that both of our speakers are very keen to encourage dialogue and debate at the end of the sessions. I think what we will do is we will take both presentations immediately, one after the other, and we will have plenty of time for questions and debate at the end of the sessions. If you do have a question, and we do encourage it, please feed your questions through using the Q&A function, and Alex will be there in the background feeding them through to our chair for today, who is Rosalind Malloy. And Rosalind is our newly appointed head of policy and practice in the Housing Agency. And Rosalind will keep us all on track through the remainder of the session. One final thing to say is that if anybody has any technical issues, please just send through a message in the chat function and we will get back to you and hopefully resolve those before we're through. Okay, with that said, then I would like to hand over to Ligia, and Ligia can take us through her presentation and we'll take it from there. Thank you all indeed.
Thank you so much, John. It's a privilege to be here. I will, first of all, just share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. Wonderful. So I would like to start, if I may, by telling you a story that I like to tell people when we're introducing them to what we're trying to do. It's a story from a very different time, the Second World War, and it's about bomber aircrafts, but it's very much the hero of our story. It's actually not a pilot, though. It's a mathematician, an academic that was helping with the war effort at the time. His name was Abraham Wald. He was essentially alongside a team tasked with helping to improve the safety of bomber aircrafts at a time when the probability of a pilot surviving a tour of duty was little better than 50-50. So to their credit, they very much looked at all the data from the returning aircraft, and the pattern seemed clear. Many of the planes were riddled with gunfire all over the wings and fuselage, but they were not being hit on the cockpit or tail. So on the back of this data, they developed what seemed like a very strong plan. They proposed that they should put extra armor on the wings and fuselage where there's the most holes. Now, of course, this decision matters because it influences, the maneuverability of the planes as well as how much fuel they consume. Now, Abraham was the only person who wasn't so sure about the plan, and he asked a question that turned out to be incredibly important, this one over here. Where are the missing holes? And he was convinced he knew the answer. The holes, the missing holes, were on the planes that never actually made it back. So important information was missing. So rather than suggesting where the additional armor was needed, the holes, the pattern they'd seen, suggested where the planes could take a hit but still make it back. So for me, this is a really important story because it really showcases how when you're doing this type of work, you have to take into account all data. You cannot immediately see. So this really matters in aviation, it matters in politics, it certainly matters in homelessness where data quality can be so poor. Then it also tells us something about the fact that learnings from data aren't always easy or obvious. We really need to be prepared to dig deeper. And this is not often talked about in order to really come up with useful insights. And finally, it's important to question basic assumptions. So Abraham was not the specialist, was not the expert in that team, but he was the person who asked a very important question. So for me, that speaks to both the importance of questioning basic assumptions as well as the importance of having mixed teams to avoid groupthink. So really important messages. And aviation more broadly is a source of inspiration for us. Why? Take how the rate of aircraft accidents is at a historical low. This hasn't come about by accident at all, but because the use of data and evidence has been designed into the whole system. And for instance, think about how when an accident happens, there is an investigation and reports are available to everyone across the globe to ensure that no one ever makes the same mistake again. Mistakes may be inevitable, but let's not make the same mistakes again. So Imagine for a second if the same meticulous rigor and testing was applied to the homelessness issue. In short, this is the challenge that the Center for Homelessness Impact has been set up to help address. Because despite our collective efforts, homelessness remains a significant issue in many communities across the UK and of course elsewhere. So there's a huge amount to be proud of and amazing people doing amazing work, but there's more that we can do, and we know that in other fields, great achievements, acceleration has been possible by applying more scientific methods. So that's what the Centre is here to help do. Our mission is to help accelerate the end of homelessness by focusing on what works, and in particular by starting a movement that can lead to more and faster learning and experimentation across the sector. We are one of 9 work centres in different areas of social policy in the UK, from areas like health, but also social care, education, and policing. And really, our focus since we launched it has been very much about building this movement. And as the world emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm guessing it's not dissimilar in Ireland, building back better has become the mantra. And of course, this is incredibly important, but certainly what the evidence suggests is that for this to happen, we need to go even further. We need to build back fairer. And obviously, homelessness is one of the things that epitomizes inequalities in any society, and it's truly devastating for not only individuals affected and their families, but obviously it's not good for society either. And people who are homeless are more likely to be the victims of violence, more likely to die than those of a similar age in the general population, and more likely to take their own life than the general public. And obviously, the focus during the pandemic has been on street homelessness, but really we're very concerned that for many, the pandemic is an invisible plight. And there's both the direct and indirect impacts of the pandemic that we need to take into account and make sure that we address inequalities as much as we can. I mean, it's definitely important to acknowledge that certainly in the UK, but we've seen examples across the globe, people have reacted to the pandemic at speed, and certainly in the UK, it's been a phenomenal effort, and over 37,000 individuals were helped. And as of January this year, more than 26,000 people were moved into settled housing or supported accommodation, and over 11,000 are still in self-contained emergency accommodation. And of course, there's been a raft of emergency measures to ensure that we protected people from becoming homeless. And no doubt whatsoever that the efforts have reduced street homelessness and certainly helped contain the number of infections. And there's been very few deaths when, and no doubt it's saved many, many lives. So it's worked, but there's a lot more work to do, it seems to be the general consensus. So what can be done? Our work at the Centre suggests that accelerating impact now will require action on 3 fronts. First of all, we need to improve the quality of the data available, because poor data quality is really weakening our ability to respond promptly. Then we also need to have access to much more robust insight into what works, for whom and where. Again, policymakers and practitioners need to have access to this information to make even better, more informed decisions, to make limited resources go further. And finally, you can have all the best evidence in the world you like, but unless you support leaders to put it into practice, change won't happen. So to take each one of those in turn quickly, obviously, it's not just in the UK, but I believe it's the same in Ireland. It's a very difficult question to answer, how many people are homeless, and obviously that's holding us back from moving as fast as we want to move. And really the pandemic's really highlighted that as a problem. But in terms of general trends that we do know about, they are not dissimilar from Ireland. So street homelessness has been going down, but the number of people in TA continues to rise, which is of course a concern. To give you an example of the types of things that can be done to improve the quality of data available, We've been working with the Office for National Statistics on a reporting platform that brings together for the first time all the evidence, all the data in particular that exists on what needs to happen to prevent homelessness at systems level. So it provides a common vision. So a society where homelessness is prevented wherever possible, or otherwise is rare, brief and non-recurring. And as of this spring, it includes not just a national level data, but also local level data across the UK. So we can start tracking progress over time, identify bright spots, and in particular, identifying gaps in the data and harmonizing that across the UK. Another example that might be useful in Ireland is a piece of work we've been doing with the Scottish Government on developing a first street homelessness system for the whole of Scotland, because at the moment they don't even have point-in-time data, as you guys at least have in Dublin. So that's another example that might be relevant there. But to move on to the next area around understanding what works, what our early work shows is that rigorous evaluations of homelessness policy and programs are still exceedingly rare, even though we know from other fields they can make a huge difference. How do we know that? Because we created a series of evidence tools that essentially map all the evidence available, evaluations available from across the globe in the English language, and it starts helping you understand what types of study you can use to understand what works and which ones you can use to understand why things work or not. So I won't play this entire video, but essentially if you go on our website, you can take a look at the tools. This other tool essentially captures all the most common interventions from across the globe. And at the moment it showcases that out of 20 listed, only 9 have any type of regressive evidence behind them, and cost effectiveness data is very poor indeed. So some work to be done, but the good news is that there's plenty of evidence out there that we can start using while we improve, address some of the gaps. But our concern is that most of the evidence comes from North America, so we need more local studies. We also know that holistic interventions appear to be more effective, but we need to understand better why that is. And even if many things seem to work, we can't do everything. So we need to be able to prioritize and understand the relative effectiveness of interventions. Now, why does this matter? Because to achieve step change, i.e. to take our great work to the next level, we need to act on the knowledge we have while questioning what we know. And why is that? Because actually many attempts to do good actually fail. Just to give you an example, the Scare Straight program from the United States was an incredibly popular program. A TV series even was done about it, and the intervention spread like wildfire. It was all about taking kids who were playing up at school into prisons to, with a view to putting them off a life of crime. The problem is that not only did Scare Straight not work, but in fact, they were very, very effective, these types of programs, at actually increasing criminal behavior. So a really good cautionary tale. And we know from other fields that actually as many as 80% of interventions that seem like no-brainers, like the example I just gave you, don't actually work. So incredibly important that we actually try out new things and test them rigorously, which is why we've now started putting together a number of new trials. So an example I have here is of a direct cash transfer program that we're about to start in Swansea, Greater Manchester and Glasgow. And it will essentially track 180 street homeless people over time, and half of them will receive a 2,000 grant, and we'll just see what happens. So we have a number of empirical trials underway in areas like this, or landlord behavior as well, mobility, out of borough mobility, and it's precisely to address that gap in empirical methods that we have. But we do have plenty of evidence we should also start, be acting upon, and we are. So just to flag a few things, obviously permanent supported housing, like Housing First, we know that it increases housing stability, so we should use it as much as we can. Then rapid rehousing seems like a very promising and cost-effective intervention, though we need to understand better how it works. Another one worth highlighting is, of course, access to health services and financial assistance of different types. Again, we want to test more the relative effectiveness of different ways of doing these things. And finally, subsidized long-term housing helps low-income households. So again, how can we do that more and better, and how can we work on landlord behavior as well in particular? So just to, start moving to the final section of the presentation, I'm often asked this question here: where is it most effective to spend the marginal pound? So I just want to start wrapping up with a few reflections on this very important question, because after all, certainly our estimates, our analysis suggests that if we end the street homelessness in the UK, the benefits and averted costs to society per year would be between 360 million to 900 million. And if we consider all households approaching housing options for support, about 300,000 households, the averted cost to society per year would be between 4 and 9 billion pounds per year. So it makes a lot of sense to consider the value for money question. Then one of the things, for instance, that we could be doing more of, and I suspect this is the same in Ireland, is reducing the cost of temporary accommodation. Obviously, it's not a bad thing that people are in temporary accommodation. At least they do have a roof over their heads. But at the moment, see how councils say in England they spent about £2 billion in homelessness services, but 70% of that money is going to temporary accommodation, and that's almost twice as much as was spent 10 years ago. And in contrast, only about 10% of this money is going towards prevention. So we need to shift that balance, and we need to make sure that people are moving much faster through the system, because it will be cheaper and it will be better for them as well. And to give you an example of the type of intervention that could be used more, and also give you a sense of the cost implications, our estimates suggest that providing housing first to every household with high support needs would cost about 400 million per year. That's 45,000 people. But this is lower than the current expense in B&Bs, which house just over 10,000 households per year. So I hope that gives you a good sense of the type of scale and cost that we're talking about. What the evidence also suggests is that to achieve breakthrough results, we really need to pay much more attention to prevention, though. So to give you another example, this time from Salt Lake City, they did a very large program of Housing First in the early 2000s. And the reductions were phenomenal at the time. So certainly the news made it across the globe how they ended chronic homelessness. But what the headlines hit was a much more complex truth, that while the numbers of chronic homeless people there had gone down, other types of homelessness continue to rise. So really, really important that in Ireland, in the UK, as we scale things like Housing First, that we don't, that we stop the flow at the same time. Incredibly important. So that obviously involves really addressing root causes of homelessness, such as this, whether it's poverty amongst family and children, the lack of truly affordable housing in the right places, access to the right services at the right time, and of course, political culture and the state of the nation's well-being also very much matters. The other thing that's worth highlighting, and I'm keen to hear your views on, is cross-sector collaboration, because certainly we have lots of debates about how, to say the Department for Housing over here, they don't always have control on all the things that cause homelessness. So how do we instigate more cross-departmental and cross-sector collaboration? At the moment, it does happen, but it's often only around the most, chronic vulnerable groups, and this needs to change. It needs to be a lot more mainstream. And really, the other thing I wanted to highlight was the importance of capacity building. One of the things that I feel really happy about in the last year was to see the amount of leaders in local areas is really wanting to do something different. So we've seen more and more examples in cities like Newcastle, Oxford, and others of leaders saying, we want to shift the system, we really want to move away from emergency housing and make that transition. But a lot of the time, it's really hard for people to actually then drive that change, implement what works. So things like our What Works community and evidence surgeries that are open to everyone free of charge. So, you know, do look out for those, are really important to help people as much as possible as they try to go through these systems change. And finally, it's really, really important and not talked about enough how important the language we use actually is, not just because we tend to focus on stories of rough sleeping and fail to tell stories that confront the link between individual homelessness and structural political causes. But in my view, also because we don't celebrate enough the fantastic work that we do in countries like ours, and certainly countries in North America and even Finland, they're much better at showcasing the fantastic work they're actually doing. And we'd like to see a change in that. And we'd like to see people acknowledge that, you know, this work is actually happening. Lots of great stuff is underway, but there's still always more work to be done, because even if things work, there's always more that you can always do. So it's because of this that we launched our End It With Evidence campaign. And I'd encourage you all to take a look on the website, get in touch if you'd like to know more. But really what it helps emphasize is this over here, that ending homelessness for good was never going to be easy, and certainly is not going to be easy now. But with humility, determination, and better methods systematically applied, we can begin to redesign the system. So I do hope to leave you with this message today of positivity, the fact that we can all do something to help end homelessness for good as individuals as well as organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lígia. We're now going to move straight to Bob Jordan, who is going to present now. And just to remind everybody, if you would like to add questions that you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Thanks very much. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Maybe, Rosalind, what you might do is disturb me after about 12 minutes, because we really want to get to the questions, obviously, here today. My name is Bob Jordan. I'm the National Director of Housing First. It's a real privilege to be here at this, at the beginning of these housing agency series of seminars, and certainly to speak after Ligia. Ligia, thank you for your very fascinating presentation. I'm going to talk about single homelessness in Ireland and the Housing First programme. And I suppose the overarching kind of approach here is the power and the benefits of evidence-based practice. So one of the things that has changed in homelessness in the last couple of years in Ireland is family homelessness and single homelessness are going in two different directions. We have a very high number of people who are homeless, 8,000, but family homelessness in 2020 went down by 30%. It's gone down by 40% from 2019. And unfortunately, single homelessness is going in the opposite direction. It's gone up by 10%. But I suppose that kind of belies really what the issue is in terms of solving it, because we have 3,500 people in family households who are homeless, but they're in 925 families. So if you look at that 4,500 people, single homeless adults nationally, we actually need 5 times more properties, because we need mostly 1 beds to solve the single homelessness issue. This looks a little bit complicated, but I just want to talk about the different profiles of people who are in emergency accommodation. This is a cluster analysis that was done between 2012 and 2016 of about 13,000 people who had used homeless emergency accommodation during that period. One of the things around homelessness that people, that sometimes is not acknowledged, is that a lot of people pass through homelessness transitionally. 78%. Average of 73 days in homelessness. So really what people need is a housing response, and the quicker that housing response gets to them, the quicker they will move out of homelessness. But there is another group, and this is the group I'm focusing in on, because this is the group that's relevant to the Housing First program. So the Housing First program targets rough sleepers, people who have long stays in emergency accommodation, who also have complex needs around mental health and addiction. There's a group of people who are in and out of homeless services, but also in and out of other services, like prisons, like hospitals, sometimes with short stays with friends. That group is about 10% of the homeless population. And then there's another group of people who have very long stays in emergency accommodation of about 12%. I suppose when you take those two groups together, though, what's interesting is that 22%, the 10% and the 12%, essentially take 2/3 of all of the nights in emergency accommodation. So there's two things going on here. One thing is, for the vast majority of single adults who are homeless, they need a home, and they need an affordable home. But for this other group, they need housing and support. They need, and sometimes very intensive support, to move them out of homelessness. But in doing that, if we focus in on that group, we can actually reduce the need for hostels and shelters very substantially. So focusing in on a small group can lead to big changes in the overall homeless services infrastructure. The Housing First model, what's different about it? I mean, really, Housing First, it was developed in the early 90s by a clinical psychologist called Dr. Samson Beres in New York City. And what it does is really turn the traditional model of responding to homelessness on its head. So in the past, I suppose, housing would really have been dangled in front of people who are homeless, but it would have been contingent on them perhaps participating in treatment programs, undertaking treatment for mental health or addiction, participating in transitional housing programs to learn independent living skills. The problem is, for the group that I'm talking about here, they never got to the permanent housing because this was an impossible ask. What Housing First does is turn all of that on its head and says that actually housing is the first response, and then that housing provides a platform for recovery for people. And in doing so, you're giving people who are homeless, ask anybody who's homeless, what do they want? They want their own place. It starts with that and builds from there. But actually, Housing First is more than a homelessness program. It's actually really a recovery program. And that's really the bigger prize, because it helps to resolve the issues that make people homeless in the first place. I can only touch on Housing First very briefly here, but just to say it provides immediate access to permanent housing. There's about 15 people sleeping on the streets of Dublin today who will be handed a key in the next couple of weeks and will move directly from the streets into their permanent home. It's theirs, that's their key. There's no preconditions around that. They don't have to change their behaviours around addiction or mental health, but they do have to accept a weekly visit from the Housing First team. And obviously, the normal rules of a tenancy apply to them. People get the promise of time unlimited supports, potentially for the rest of their lives. And that support turns up at their door, tenancy supports, mental health supports, and addiction supports. But it's dictated by the person's own choices. If a tenancy breaks down, what I always say is you can be evicted from a Housing First tenancy for the normal reasons that any of us would be evicted from a tenancy, but you can't be evicted from the Housing First programme. So if a tenancy breaks down, you will be rehoused in another permanent home. And as I said, consumer choice, the person themselves and their decisions are really very much at the heart of Housing First. We have a national Housing First plan. Housing First started in Ireland with a pilot project in 2011. It became mainstream in Dublin from 2014, and a national plan came in 2018. That was my task, to develop that plan, led jointly by the Departments of Housing and Health. That's the most powerful aspect of Housing First, is it brings housing and health supports together in a way that makes huge differences for people who are homeless. Delivering the original model developed by Samson Beres in New York. We have a national target to deliver 663 tenancies by the end of this year, which we will do. And that kind of odd number is based on an assessment of need that we carried out back in 2018. Every local authority in the country has a responsibility to deliver Housing First, and it's ordered in 9 regional services. And just to say, since October of last year, we've extended Housing First into the prison system, because there are an awful lot of people, as I mentioned, those episodically homeless people who are in and out of homeless services, but also in and out of prison. Working with them in prison so that they don't move from prison onto the streets, but move into a Housing First tenancy. And there's a whole range of implementation supports, a national training program, training manual, action research to surface implementation issues, a national evaluation, and so on. So we've wrapped very intensive supports, not only around the Housing First clients, but around the Housing First services that are supporting those clients. What's the benefit of this evidence-based model for clients? They're at the center of the decision-making. It's a client-directed model. It ends homelessness for 85% of people. That's our current success rate in Ireland. It matches the best success of programs internationally. That means that almost 9 out of 10 people will remain permanently out of homelessness. And when we talk about people here, we're talking about people who have been homeless for decades, often starting in their teens. As I said earlier, the focus here is really on recovery. You know within 9 months whether somebody is going to remain in their permanent housing. The bigger prize is really around supporting them around their mental health, addiction, and other issues, and improving their quality of life. And housing is a social determinant of health. So housing provides a platform for recovery from these issues. Social integration is really important, becoming part of a community, being involved in community groups, taking part in all the normal things that we take part in, because that really allows the person themselves to leave the label of homelessness far behind them. Peer support is also an important aspect of the programme. So people with a lived experience of homelessness or a lived experience of mental health and addiction issues being part of the delivery of the programme, working inside the programme. And the difference they make sometimes is when somebody disengages from the programme, it's a peer worker that turns up and talks through the letterbox to say to the person, I know where you're at, I've been there myself, let's talk about it. And very often it is the peer worker that gets the person re-engaged with the programme. In terms of government, I think evidence-based programs like Housing First give government confidence to make all sorts of shifts in the way they do things. Shifts in strategy, as I said, moving away from a transitional model, a staircase model, towards a Housing First model. A shift in collaboration, getting the housing and health departments and indeed local authorities and HSEs and HSC services throughout the country to work together in a very collaborative way. And the reason they can do that is because their roles are very defined within Housing First. We're not asking local authorities to do anything but housing, and we're not asking health services to do anything but health. But what we are asking them to do is to work together with this kind of shared client group to end homelessness. And finally, a shift in data. Sometimes the people that I'm talking about have been described in the past as treatment resistant, distant from services, unhousable. They're number one priority. The people that fall into that category and would have been kind of left out of programs in the past are the number one priority for Housing First. And in doing, I suppose, for government then, it's very clear when you start doing these things, you start to see systemic gaps. Systemic gaps are the things I talked about earlier, the lack of one-bed properties for single individuals. We need that to resolve single-person homelessness. The fact that sometimes psychiatric services, insist that people come to their consultations. That's not possible for people under the Housing First programme. So creating peripatetic models of delivering health services. And in terms of data, very often we don't have great data around health outcomes for people. And part of the Housing First programme in Ireland has been developing a monitoring tool to really measure progress in health outcomes for people who are homeless. Sorry, I've gone backwards there. Practitioners, we're nearly there. In terms of practitioners, it's around developing new partnerships and protocols. Some of the I suppose regional Housing First services have to develop new models of clinical governance, new models of care. There's two levels, I suppose, to rolling out Housing First, and I think what's really important is getting people's heads around it. So we've done a lot of awareness events to explain to people how this works before moving to implementation. I think in terms of, when I talk about crossing the Rubicon here, the hardest Housing First tendency to get across the line is the first one. And in terms of modelling the future, there are parts of the country where there are no homeless hostels and shelters, and Housing First is the primary response to homelessness. So obviously we're modelling a future where we no longer need to create this homelessness infrastructure. And finally, it's around, for practitioners, it's around self-improvement and reflective practice. We've set up a national community of practice involving health workers, local authority workers, and not-for-profit agencies to talk about the clients that they're working with and share best practice. This is the final slide. There are people working in homeless services who have never seen a homeless person exit homelessness, have never handed them a key, have never filled their kitchen cupboard with food, have never visited them in their home. Housing First is now everywhere. And what it allows organizations to do is to see and witness people exiting homelessness, because that changes the whole mindset about how we deliver homeless services. Obviously, if you're seeing that on a daily basis, you want more of it, and it helps to reorient services. While there's, flexibility within the Housing First program in terms of, support workers turning up to people's doors to support them, we obviously want that to be the norm in the mainstream as well. Now, we're still far away from that, but there are parts of the country where the mainstream HSE in Limerick and Cork is delivering supports to people's door. So we're seeing the beginnings of a new future. Offering people supports, it's not enough to offer people accommodation, you need to offer them medical supports as well, and how we tailor those packages to the individual is really important. Service reconfiguration, we are going to build more hostels and shelters in Ireland, but can we at least think about what they could be used for in the future? Can they be converted into apartments? Thinking ahead about, a time when we're dismantling that system. And finally, obviously, we want a world where there's more housing and hostels. We know hostels are a harm reduction measure. They're not a permanent response to people who are homeless. So that's where we want to get to. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. And you were just within your time. I didn't have to remind you. So thank you. So we've had some questions in, and I think I'm going to start with a question to you, Ligia, which is, I suppose it's a question about the cash transfers. You were mentioning different things that were effective. So could you say a little bit more about cash transfers and their impact on homelessness?
Absolutely. So we're very interested in helping, leaders in local communities identify promising interventions, a bit like Housing First, and we're very interested in interventions that help promote agency, which is one of the things that Housing First does. So cash transfers, believe it or not, are one of the interventions across the globe with the strongest evidence behind it in terms of their effectiveness as an anti-poverty measure. But they're very much underused in homelessness. So examples do exist in the form of the personalized budget pilots that were set up in the early 2000s in England and Wales. But they never really scaled, partly, I think, because they were never tested properly. Cash transfers in homelessness, the idea is that it takes that idea a step further so that the money goes directly to the individuals. And essentially, you just trust the individuals to make use of the money, because what the evidence suggests from across the globe is fascinating. People do use the money well. They don't use it on luxury goods, and they tend to save. And the impacts are very long term. So in some programs that we came across, the young people who received the grant were much more likely to be in good employment 4 or 5 years down the line. So we're very interested in creating a program of work that will use cash transfers in all sorts of ways. So we're starting with street homeless in these 3 pilot areas with our partners. But the idea is then to start using them with, say, young people approaching the council for help, care leavers, prison leavers, all types of subpopulations. And then we have an RCT, we have a randomized control trial happening alongside it. So we're really able to understand what's working and not. Yeah. So the initial pilot is just 180 people. Like I said, half of them will receive the grant and half won't. But the idea is that over time, everyone, if it's working, you continue to scale it and everyone eventually will have access to a grant.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, would you like to come in on that, or will I move to another question? Oh, and you need to unmute, sorry.
Another question, sorry.
Okay, so I suppose there were a couple of questions coming through for kind of relating to your talk, Bob, which were around, I suppose, the supports and the capacity for the program, both to be, I suppose, in terms of the social support that's there and the services that are there, kind of, are there sufficient support services to deliver the complex needs? And I suppose related to that, is the length of contracts for Housing First, that at the moment, it was a question is around 3 to 5 years. Is this kind of, in terms of limitless supports, enough time to kind of for consistency for the program to be rolled out? So maybe if you have something to say on that, Bob.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I suppose, first of all, the services were commissioned in the first place based on the Housing First model. So the funding support is provided through the Department of Housing and the Department of Health. And obviously that needs to match the number of people who are in the Housing First plan. So the answer is these 9 Housing First services have very close fidelity with the Housing First model. And we know that because the University of Limerick is doing a national evaluation that's very much showing that to us. And we also know because of the success rate for participants in the program. So that's very reassuring. But obviously, you know, we're coming to the end of a 3-year plan, and we will be publishing another 3-year plan towards the end of this year. And that will obviously have more ambitious targets given the number of single people who are homeless. One of the issues is around, as I mentioned, the availability of 1-bed properties. That's what we need for Housing First. About 5 to 10% of the social housing output program is currently 1-bed properties. So that's wholly inadequate. And I mean, obviously, what I keep saying is Housing First is really the canary in the coal mine when it comes to the lack of 1-bed properties, because we have 4,500 individuals who probably need 1-beds in the main, and over 50% of people on local authority waiting lists actually need it. But you know, I'm pretty confident that the housing strategy that's being published by government in a couple of weeks will highlight the need to increase the supply of 1-bed properties, because if we don't do that, we can't resolve housing insecurity or indeed single person homelessness. In terms of, like, obviously the government have made a promise in terms of the Housing First program. The promise is that people will get time unlimited support for the rest of their lives, and that they will get permanent housing or rehoused in permanent housing where their tenancies fall apart. So, or you know, where there's a breakdown or where they choose to leave that property. So, like, the program will continue. The first 3-year plan was about getting working models up and running across the country that matched the original Housing First program. And it's very clear that the government, from everything that the Ministers for Housing and Health have said, that they're hugely committed to continuing this program.
Can I just congratulate you for that, because that's so unusual. So there's some work being done in UK, as you probably know, scaling in England and certainly in Scotland very strongly. But the whole funding and the length of the funding is a huge concern, because there's no equivalent commitment to what you just described, Bob. Well, the other thing I really liked about what you said was that very clear sense of this is the target group we're aiming for. And these are the people, they just need a home and some financial assistance. They don't need Housing First. And that clarity will also really serve you very well. So, no, really impressive.
Thank you, Ligia.
Okay, Lígia, another question for you, which is around, I suppose, the programs that aren't making significant impact or aren't cost effective. Why do you think they're still being implemented?
That's a very good question. I suppose we are trapped by ways of doing things, right? And in particular, because obviously governments and local authorities have a legal responsibility towards vulnerable populations. It's really hard to stop doing things that you've been doing for a while. That's part of the reason. And certainly one of the crucial bits of evidence we do have good enough evidence on is the thing that Bob you know, also highlighted in his talk, that most of the people coming through the system, they just need you know, affordable housing, they need some financial help. But at the moment, most individuals, they, you know, are placed in emergency accommodation, incredibly costly. We know the outcomes won't be as good. And it's really hard for local areas to move away from existing practices and commissioning methods, and funding mechanisms don't help, because a lot of the time they're very short term. So local areas are always constantly having to make business cases that for 12-month plans. It's simply not good enough. But that's one of the things that it's very much certainly at the forefront of the local areas we're working with. Is like, we know the system we've developed over the years is not as effective as it could be. So how can we start shifting? How can we start moving towards a more housing-led system, so that people either get housing first, or other types of affordable housing as quickly as possible. But it's that issue I highlighted. Most of the money that is going towards homelessness is going towards temporary accommodation, and the costlier type of temporary accommodation. So we're going to need creativity. We're going to need greater experimentation to start to introduce new ways of working. So it's about both having the tools and the methods to come up with new ideas, but it's also about, I suppose, local areas wanting to try out new things, and that's to do with cultural change as well. All of those things are very much connected.
Okay, thank you very much, Lígia. Bob, I suppose again the connection to that, there's been a kind of few questions in about emergency accommodation, and I suppose the need for one-bed apartments, and even the rigidity maybe perhaps around one-bed apartment and accommodation for those people who have children that they in care, and support packages that could be put in place to help towards accessing that. So I suppose the question is, do you see the Housing First programme kind of moving on, that and I suppose decreasing the reliance on emergency accommodation?
That's
and
the aim,
hostel
Rosalind.
accommodation? Yeah.
As I said right at the very beginning, we have a group of people here who their needs are not being met by emergency accommodation. They're stuck in emergency accommodation for years, or they're in and out of other institutions of the state. That's the group we're focusing in on, all of them. And the aim is to deliver Housing First to all of those people over a number of years, to reduce and eliminate chronic homelessness in Ireland. And just to be clear, that has been done in other countries, in places where they have very large Housing First programs, like in Canada. The percentage of chronic homelessness is really very low. So this is something I think that, Ligia touched on. We want the experience of homelessness to be as rare as possible, as brief as possible, and happen one time. And the only way to do that is to have a very responsive system. But at the moment, we are in the middle of a change management process. So there is business as usual in terms of hostels and shelters, but there is also the seeds of the new future. And the seeds of that future is where people can move directly from the streets into their permanent home, or people who have had long stays in hostels and shelters, sometimes for decades, can finally get their permanent home. And when they do get it, we know that 9 out of every 10 of them will stay permanently out of homelessness and leave that label of homelessness behind, which is so important, and then move on with their lives. It's not just about being inside a house, but it's about then moving on in terms of recovery and social integration, and kind of realizing their dreams around employment and so on. And all of those things are happening under the Housing First programme, and they're things we're working on.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Just maybe a question to both of you, maybe Lígia first. I think, what do you think the impact has been on the of COVID-19 on, I suppose, our learnings, how the response to homelessness that was brought in there, and the responses. So do you think, kind of going forward, what have been the learnings that you have seen? And then maybe Bob, we might go to you.
Let's focus on the positive. We know that in times of crisis, and it's a human response, this happens all the time. If there's a crisis, people tend to rise to the challenge, and there's a new level of energy, and people just get on with it. And we saw that all over the world, which is very energizing and really, really positive. I suppose what I'm interested in is, how do we keep that energy going now? Because the worst impact of the pandemic when it comes to our population haven't been felt yet, I don't think. Obviously, we've had emergency measures in many countries. Those are starting to be lifted. And we have a huge amount of work to do to make sure that the safety net is there to create a better society for all. Because this is the thing that we need to talk about even more. Homelessness is just an experience, and ending homelessness doesn't just help the individuals affected and their families, but it helps create a better society for all. So there's a real risk at the moment that things are about to get a lot worse in most countries. So we'll need to continue to listen to the evidence and act promptly on the evidence, which I believe we did when the pandemic started. So that would be my message and also my plea for continued action.
Thanks, Lígia. Bob, do you like to add to Lígia?
Just to reiterate what Lígia has said, I mean, what's been COVID-19, obviously the response has been led by public health. And I think that's filled in a lot of blanks for people who are homeless, around people who have chronic health problems, people with addiction issues, people with mental health issues. And the collaboration, we know that when there's a breakdown between housing and health, the damage it does to people, but we can also see the power of housing and health departments working together on behalf of people. Just to give like brief examples, one would be opioid substitution therapy, methadone. Took 6 weeks before COVID, 3 days, and people were having their treatment brought to their door. A total change in the kind of systemic approach. We need to make sure that these kind of gains are not lost, that the ratchets are put in place to maintain those responses, because they're the right responses. Similar, I work obviously in Dublin City Council here, working on the response to people rough sleeping on the streets. Again, what we've seen is a lot more people from health services working alongside teams that are offering people accommodation to deal with all of their needs, because sometimes it's the offer of a bed isn't something that people readily take up, but they will take up the offer of a bed and maybe a treatment place, or or a stabilization program or so on. So listen, I really, like Lígia, I really hope that the gains that we've made during this period, which have had such a powerful impact in terms of preventing people from getting COVID, are maintained, after all of this is done.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Just the housing and health, definitely. I've seen it in the area of housing for older people, and coming together, and it really is working kind of there as well. Just about the Housing First programme, there've been two or three questions, Bob, and it's about the rollout of it to more rural areas, and whether it, how successful. I suppose it's the evaluation you talked about, that you are, working on the evaluations, but how successful do you feel the Housing First implementation in more rural counties of Ireland, as the model is predominantly for urban areas? Now, I'm just conscious of the time as well, so we probably just have a kind of
I'll be very quick.
Short, brief time. Yeah.
So, like around the world, there is an urban and rural model of Housing First. So, obviously, the issue in rural areas is that people can be quite dispersed. It takes a long time. So it takes a long time for support workers sometimes to get around to everybody. What we've done, and what the regions themselves have decided to do, is kind of use towns as kind of hubs for operating the Housing First programme. So not scattering people around all of the counties, but I suppose focusing in maybe on the rural towns and areas where people are most likely to be homeless. So, and we've learned from places like Vermont and the United States about providing kind of remote supports and so on. And obviously the people that are working in these areas do already operate in a slightly different way. Local authorities operate in a slightly different way, as do health services. So I would say, rural Housing First in Ireland has just been as successful as everywhere else, and just as successful as urban Housing First.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. I think we're going to we've really 1 minute left now, so I'm actually going to say thank you to both of the speakers. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all the questions that were coming through there, but I want to thank you both for your fantastic contribution. Thank you also to the audience for listening. I hope that there will be some takeaways there for people who've been listening, that you can take away and share with your colleagues. Just to point people, Bob mentioned, there's the Housing First National Implementation Plan that's 2018 to 2021 that's up on the gov.ie website, and I'm sure the new one, when it's ready at the end of the year, will be there as well and available. And the www.homelessnessimpact.org website has lots of resources and evidence tools and some more information on what Ligia was talking about today that you can look into. So the next talk in the summer series is going to be, as John said at the beginning, Thursday, the 29th of July. We're going to have Dr. Breach Casey from DCU and Gary Broderick from the director of the SAIL project, who will be speaking at that. So I hope you will join us, and thank you very much for listening this lunchtime.